where those who perceive truth may strive to make others see.
A big, powerful America, and shoot them for what?
On that continent, we are trying to forge a new identity for which we need each other.
With the last words on my lips, that I am a revolutionary, and you're going to have to keep on saying that.
I want you to imagine that you come home to an eviction notice after not being able to pay your rent. Demoralized, you continue to open the door with the groceries that you could afford today in your arms. You go inside and you see that a letter has been slid under your door. You open this letter and you realize that it's an invitation for you and your family to live in a new development. This development is built underground, but it is made to provide occupants with a living experience of an above-ground living environment, and also provide ample opportunity for sunlight exposure. Apparently, you and your family would be a part of a pilot program for affordable housing and have the option of paying reduced rent once you get on your feet. Great education and professional development opportunities would be provided, and in addition, your room and board would be taken care of. Today we're going to be talking about underground space design, or particularly underground construction in the Renaissance. And we'll be referencing underground space design by John Carmody and Raymond Sterling. The intro wasn't, of course, from the actual book itself, but I'm passionate about using space and underground construction in terms of how it can help us really expand our society in general in a more healthy fashion, while we kind of get things together on the surface, I suppose. There are plenty of issues that we'll talk about, but exploring this idea of underground space development and usage is a conversation that really helps us in ways that may not even be immediately apparent to everyone involved. And when it comes down to this Renaissance, I believe we'll have to prioritize mastering our own world and before we go off and try to explore space. And in doing so, I think we'll gain experience to do the later. A quote that I found that I really like is, "We didn't evolve to live underground, but we didn't evolve to live in skyscrapers either." More than 4 billion people, or more than half of the world, live in urban areas. And if you're on YouTube, you can kind of see the graph to get the actual image of the increase in population for urban areas in general. There's a lot that needs to be done in cities and in developing cities in general, but when it comes down to future generations, they're really going to depend on how we choose really correct the development process of today. Now, underground spaces, they can vary in depth, but in particularly shallow depths below cities are typically a problem due to unorganized wiring, plumbing, and infrastructure that was laid really before we thought about any type of development underground. Shallow depths can still be a conversation even within a city or developed city at certain locations, but we should understand that there's going to be a really big difference depending on really the depth of the space. When we talk about underground construction, this idea, this concept has different meaning depending on who you may be talking to, right? So if you're talking about just the average norming in today's world, they're not going to particularly think that below ground or underground development is going to be a tremendous depth underground. Say, when we talk about comparing this concept to someone who's in the mining field or the mining area, when it comes down to deep underground spaces, they can have magnitudes of difference in terms of how they think about things, how they think about that term in general. I think it's worth thinking about both in terms of the meanings of how we utilize space, period. Because when it comes down to expansions and things of that nature, we'll talk a bit about kind of the more common expansions into underground space. But more uncommon, of course, is going to be the deep underground spaces that are going to have natural stigmas related to really any type of underground development. We think about those particular depths. Now, other than wires and pipes, we have several uses for underground spaces in general. This idea of train stations, mining tunnels, storage facilities, even things like water treatment, and sometimes even shopping centers. Building out underground spaces is a pretty popular method of creating additions onto buildings. Like, for instance, libraries and office buildings will use underground spaces for archives and storage. We may have to really develop this concept of underground usage as particularly being thought of the way we think of a new ground floor. And that may be a more powerful definition for how we really approach this concept. And the idea here is that the government or larger entities would be really responsible for creating larger developments for individuals to purchase maybe smaller spaces. One thing that really stuck out to me while reading was this idea of how underground spaces could lead to really deviations from society as we know it as above ground. And this concept could be easily linked to things like laws and really governance in general when it comes down to defining ownership, that idea of a new surface or a new ground level floor. It's going to have a lot of reverberations through really how we continue on existing even above ground. Right now we have laws that don't necessarily think about the space underground, of course. So when we talk about defining ownership of a surface level land, that idea of limiting space owned to a certain depth is going to be something that we have to think about more and more. And we'll talk about a particular development or reference a particular development where that was exactly the case. And I think it's something that needs to be thought of in the future as we pursue this even more. The idea of classification is also going to be huge for underground spaces. We'll get into a bit of things around safety and how we classify certain areas that would really substitute the safety that we would assume comes from exiting a building above ground. So the concept of classification in general, though, it helps us in terms of really categorizing construction, the regulations. These are going to be significant endeavors for really trying to expand a society to this particular area. We need to think about things like building codes, the concept of really zoning in an underground area. Living and using underground space isn't necessarily new, and there are cities and locations all around the world where this has been seen as a more valuable option than a lot of us, particularly in America, have. In one location, particularly Coober Pedy in Australia, this development really came about due to essentially life being very harsh above surface. And that idea of life being hard above surface led people to really start to dig underground for particular spaces, and it turned into particularly a lucrative endeavor for them because the idea of Coober Pedy, Australia, their land was filled with really wealthy minerals. And that's another concept that really the book talks about, because we need to start thinking about really how underground spaces have been used when we start to really dig there. And this is going to be naturally when it comes down to developing spaces and being really more efficient with what we do have. The concept of living and utilizing space underground, a lot of times that will come into really direct overlap. I won't say conflict. It'll come into direct overlap with things like mining, and particularly like drilling when it comes, even when it comes down to drilling for oil and things of that nature. We'll have to start to think more and more about that in terms of particularly conflicts of interest. Another city is Cappadocia. I apologize if I'm slaughtering that, but Cappadocia covers the region between the cities of Nevşehir, Ürgüp, and Avanos. The cities or the sites of Karain, Karik, Yesilov, Soganli. God, I'm so sorry if I'm messing these up. And the subterranean cities of Kaimekli and Derinkuyu. This 100 square miles with more than 200 underground villages and tunnel towns, and they're complete with hidden passages, secret rooms, ancient temples, and there's a remarkable history that comes along with these particular spaces. And really each of these new civilizations was building on the work of the last. And if you go now at really Cappadocia, what you'll see is there's a lot of festivals that take place that really admire and look at what's there now, but also people who, still live there. Now, outside of Tokyo, the metropolitan area outer underground discharge channel is referred to as Tokyo Gikans. And this is the world's largest underground floodwater diversion facility. And the system was designed to particularly mitigate flooding in typhoons and heavy rainfall. Another noteworthy project is the London Thames Tideway Tunnel. And according to Tideway.com, the new London Tideway Tunnel is now working, and it intercepts and stores, ultimately transferring sewage waste away from the River Thames. 4 giant tunneling machines were used to excavate the main super sewer, each named after inspirational woman with a connection to the local area. In terms of really developing a lot of these spaces, I think there's a variety of different ways to use underground space, of course, but when it comes down to really starting to consciously expand into this space for existing cities, it's important that we understand that we can baby step into them. We don't necessarily have to go full-fledged force into utilizing underground spaces for living. For instance, we can start off particularly with parking and that element of parking. One particular idea that I've gotten from, I believe it's Great Cities in the Renaissance, is the idea of, for instance, cities not necessarily having to be developed to be more efficient in how you store vehicles or use vehicles. It's more so it can essentially be personal vehicles are no longer allowed on particular roads and stretches of area. And we see this in the opposite way in terms of we'll see, streets where only personal vehicles are allowed. And we can kind of turn that around in terms of developing cities even more. And of course, as space grows more precious, this seems like an idea that would really help transition us into that new world. One of the biggest hurdles is essentially coming from lack of government and governmental direction and regulation. The idea is nobody wants to build underground and find out they have to disassemble or make repairs afterwards, or just be subject to some kind of lawsuit. Insurance would be another hurdle, because when it comes down to pricing insurance, it's a price based on a probability. And when it comes down to ensuring underground developments that have never existed before, or it's going to be hard to really price out how much would it cost to cover this particular development. Talking about that really development in Australia, that city in Australia, it's really important that we understand that mining for space is valuable in its own right. But when it comes down to underground development for space in particular, mining is different in terms of when you have valuable resources that can be sold. You can essentially develop an area that pays for itself in the development of that area. When it comes down to older mines or abandoned mines, we have to understand that these particular places may not be really up to standard when it comes down to concepts around structural integrity, and it may force us into some very precarious situations. Some really good things, I think, would be the idea of construction underground being subject to less wear and tear due to not really being exposed to the normal pressures of above ground environments. When it comes down to trying to figure out how long a product is going to last, a lot of it, in terms of a lot of the wear and tear that we predict, does come from being exposed to the weathers above ground. In terms of construction materials, how we do construction, this goes back to that concept of categorization and how we really start to understand building in these spaces versus building in above spaces in terms of the regulations, the pressures that are going to really be unique to underground developments. Another thing that really comes to mind is the idea of refrigeration being cheaper underground because the temperature is more stable. And that concept can really expand into a lot of different areas. In terms of an example would be particularly HVAC. I know that there are some particular cases where we can't expect, I guess it would be cooling in certain areas because of how the particular underground environment may not be efficient in releasing heat. But in terms of cooling and the concept of geothermal heating, that may be something that really helps us in terms of paying for the particular cost of moving underground and developing ground spaces. Now, we talked about laws a little bit, and when it comes down to a particular place in Singapore, particularly, they invested $188 million in underground technology, research development, and they reformed the land laws so that homeowners only could own space up to their basement or as deep as their basement. I think particularly us in America, we'd have to really be careful about this idea of how we really handle this. I think we're a bit more sensitive about land ownership and what happens in regard to really property rights in general. If you're trying to learn more about Singapore, there's a article particularly where I got this particular insert from, and that's on nextcity.org. It'll be in the link in the description as well. Another concept that we may have brushed against is the seed vault in Norway, right? This is a global seed vault, and this particular place was constructed to really survive extreme events above surface, and that would naturally lead to underground development for this particular vault. And when it comes down to this particular vault, it's called the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. I am so sorry if I'm butchering that, but the idea and the quote from the website, which is seedvault.no, is that we offer safe and free long-term storage of seed duplicates from all gene banks and nations participating in the global community's joint effort to ensure the world's future food supply. Now, these projects, they're good, right? They're painting a very positive picture and a positive light of underground life and construction. But it's important that we realize that there are several problems with underground spaces that are actually linked more so with the perception. They are thought of as particularly damp and dark. They're associated with also being of lower status. They can also be thought of as more cramped and stressful. There are also more direct issues. They can be disorienting for occupants. Occupants can actually have been shown to heal slower without the sun, and it can also throw off the circadian rhythm. The idea of fires and how they act in underground spaces, how fire would play out in an underground space is also something that's to be thought of as differently. And in addition to that, gases can accumulate in certain areas in an underground space that we really don't think about in above ground spaces. Now, this particular development, my mouth dropped just really seeing this particular development, right? This is called this Beijing's rat tribe in basement apartment. So they kind of started this idea of underground development in Beijing, but they did not, in this particular case, take things into account in terms of making this place livable or appealing in a lot of different cases. I'm going to read a quote from Chi Yin Sim from April 8th, 2015, and the PulitzerCenter.org. For these underground dwellers, at least for the time being, the dream is much simpler. Make a life for themselves and find a place to eat and sleep, even if it means living in a small, often dank room. As the cheapest housing in all the city at 400 to 800 renminbi, roughly $64 to $128 a month, rooms are often around 160 square feet or smaller. They're separated from other quarters by a sheet of plywood. The smaller basement compound contains roughly 20 to 30 a room. Larger ones hold up to 100 or more. So these are separate units in those particular spaces. Many come with communal bathrooms and shared kitchens through some forbid cooking. Now, this was, when it comes down to really trying to just expand underground without necessarily hiring any type of contractors to specialize in making this space more livable, this is what you get in a lot of cases. And this sounds nightmarish, to be honest with you. And I think even when it comes down to the introduction, it still makes me cringe to think of, using underground spaces still. But projects like this, unfortunately, they make me more hopeful in terms of how we can really develop these spaces to be more livable rather than places that are just neglected, period. Now, in this particular book, there's a lot of ways to design around problems with underground spaces. Particularly, one is the entryway, and this can help tremendously, right? Elevators would be preferable to stairs. The concept is if you are really forced to go downstairs, that idea and that perception starts to build even more in terms of the negative thoughts and the negative perception of being underground. And that's the psychology there, I think, needs to really, really be thought of when it comes down to developing the entryway and how we develop the entryway in particular. When it comes down to above ground entrances, they can help tremendously. You can create transitions into the particular space. So these underground spaces don't necessarily have to be completely separate from existing buildings in any way, shape, or form. And they can be built and really developed from the entrance point of these buildings to really be more appealing for people when they actually enter and also when they leave. When it comes down to utilization of these particular spaces, more engaging work is less likely to lead to problems. So if you have monotonous work where, of course, you find yourself staring out a window every 2 seconds, underground spaces are going to be much less appealing to you than if you have some kind of work where you're particularly engaged for a large percentage of time. Open space design is better. The idea is that concept of claustrophobia, we gotta turn that on its head in a lot of cases. When it comes down to ceiling heights, make things taller, and you have that opportunity with underground spaces in a lot of instances, and you really want to take that into account when particularly developing these areas in these spaces. Lights can also be made to replicate the natural sun in terms of radiation, the angle, and the dimness for the time of day. One thing that really struck out to me was the radiation. The radiation that we really receive most of the benefits from with the sun is something that can be duplicated into unnatural light fixtures, and that is something that we can really design around, but also the angles that you choose. So choosing light to come from solely above may be unnatural in different circumstances, and we should really think about how we situate the lights in terms of creating that more natural effect. And we'll go over we'll just mention a particular company that is really on top in terms of really creating natural light in indoor environments, or creating fixtures that replicate natural light. Another thing is the idea of safe spaces having to be fire resistant, and how we do that is going to particularly be a challenge, right? So when it comes down to construction, a lot of the guardrails revolving around constructing above ground are going to have to be adapted for underground spaces. When it comes down to particularly safe spaces for fire that keep people safe from a fire, you would necessarily really create this room to be supplied constantly without necessarily having a outtake of air. The idea here is you don't want the fire to get sucked into the room, and by creating a constant supply of air, you create a positive pressure that really pushes fire out rather than sucks fire in. Glass elevators would also help ease the idea of disorientation and really prevent claustrophobia as well. Underground spaces would be more expensive in terms of really a lot of the getting rid of the stigma of this being of lesser quality has to be something that's really on the forefront in terms of when you design a lot of these spaces. And a lot of that is going to come from the materials and the spaces in general and how much headroom, and really trying to dispel that idea and that feeling through design. Another idea is to label floors in a way that's easy to understand, and maybe create ways to really categorize floors and separate them from one another by simply walking through them. So for instance, this is a horrible example, but say one floor is blue and another floor is yellow, you kind of have that concept of blue and yellow playing throughout the floor itself. So the rooms and the doors, everything, you can see that and really help dispel the natural disorientation that a lot of people can feel in underground spaces. And a lot of these recommendations are really due to just dispelling the myth of being of lesser quality being associated with underground spaces. And another concept that's really linked to this is creating complex shapes that create the feeling of spaciousness. Two rooms with the same amount of square footage would feel different if one room is built with more corners and built in a more complex pattern in terms of the geometry of the room than one that's simply a square box. Another thing is really creating, of course, open spaces are good, but also when it comes down to shared spaces, expanding that level of openness. When it comes down to underground spaces, there needs to be a clear demarcation in, I would say, the ceiling height of a shared space versus those more private spaces, and really spending the time and effort to create that would be worthwhile in terms of really creating more community in these spaces in general. Another thing is creating flags on supply vents so that people can see that air is flowing. And the idea here is that claustrophobia, dispelling that feeling of claustrophobia, could be essentially just seeing that air is flowing. There is a lot of psychology involved in terms of building environments in general, but especially when it comes down to developing underground spaces, because you're designing to battle a lot of perceptions that are really inherent to underground spaces. Art with natural environments are going to really be prioritized and just prioritized over any type of art that is, let's say, just the Picasso style and things of that nature. And this is kind of battling the idea of window spaces not being particularly valuable. And when we talk about art in these particular spaces, it's really important that we think of art as more than simply visually appealing pieces of mesh, particularly, right? So for instance, if you have sculptors, and those are particularly going to be put in places that can also help orient a person. So we talk about fighting that feeling of disorientation. It can be put as a marker for a particular place and where you're at in a particular environment. When it comes down to natural walls and natural materials, fighting that idea of lower quality, those are going to be things that really help, right? So when you create walls and decide what goes into creating a wall in a space, more natural environments can help. So that can mean exposing a wall in certain cases. That can mean creating just a more artistic element rather than simply just trying to board something up. I feel like this may be easier for me to think about because I'm in the construction field, but I'm also in the artist field as well, so I have an appreciation for both. But it is going to help to have that idea of what we can do here. We can't just leave it up to I'm sorry to say this, but just a grunt dude that does not appreciate really what art can do and the power of art itself. We can also create natural ways for natural light to penetrate into the space. So this can be a variety of things when it comes down to creating these particular spaces. Of course, the closer you are to the surface, the easier this is going to be, but a series of tunnels and mirrors, things of that nature, you can create that. Another good thing to really keep in mind is creating lights that are structured and really pattern to the circadian rhythm. So lights that get dim at night, or lights that even keep track of or follow the light that's available on the surface. Those are going to be things that we really want to start to think about. And lights, when we think about lights and how we create a lit environment, a lot of times we don't necessarily have to make sure the entire room is well lit. We can simply create pools of light that are going to really be really helpful in navigating a space, rather than creating light to simply just light up entire rooms and really create light and dictate where light is in a room based on how that room is going to be used itself. I think we do this in a lot of cases, and I think this is something that, at least when it comes down to architects, the way they design light, I think it's natural for them in a lot of cases. but we got to pay attention to that even more so in these spaces in particular, because like I said, it's a design heavy process in terms of what happens in case of any emergency situations. When it comes down to the concept of emergency lights, it may be easier to keep, or it may be preferable to keep these emergency lights to a lower floor level in case smoke actually is involved in this particular emergency, and maybe block off light that's available above. And also, when it comes down to emergency situations, there are systems like, for instance, the carbon dioxide systems that may be better for fighting fires in certain situations. Say, for instance, when it comes down to the archives that we talked about earlier, that a lot of libraries, offices use, these ideas of fighting a fire won't necessarily really prioritize the idea of going in and just spraying water everywhere or the fire extinguisher everywhere, because of what it could do to damage those particular documents or that particular space in general. And it's a lot involved with underground spaces, and please pick up the book. It was made in, I think, either the early 90s or the late 80s, I believe, but it is still very much something that we should think about, have in our understanding of underground and spaces and environments in general. I mean, the stuff is, even when it comes down to creating basements, it really helped to have that perspective. A few pioneers that we really think is worth noting is Colux Lighting, right? So that's the natural lighting company where really skylights were valuable, and or they're making skylights available, but also doing just creating that natural environment for indoors. Lucien Lagrange, it's an architect with Montreal's Réseau Underground Network. Rolf Disch, that's the German solar architect with the Earth Sheltered Homes. And the Tideway Corporation of Tokyo, and this is the link to the concept of Alice cities. I'm not sure where Alice cities are now, but I know they are built based on tiers, and it seems like a very, very strong concept in terms of really thinking about how to use and utilize underground spaces. For those that don't know, like, Japan's really on top when it comes down to utilizing underground spaces in general, and it's definitely something worth looking at. When it comes down to like how crowded cities like Tokyo are or things like that, they are very much thinking about how to do this, and I would say they're thinking about it in a way that's very much pioneering comfort as well as just development in general. When it comes down to the tunneling technology, or really construction technology for underground spaces, you have the tunnel boring machines, and particularly the biggest one is called Qin Liangyu, and I am probably butchering that, but it's one of the biggest boring machines, and it's currently being used for particularly roads and really transportation, as you'll find in a lot of cases. Very, very important in terms of understanding the concept of what's available now and what it can be used for. Also, I mean, when it comes down to technology in general, I think we'll really see this, but Petra is a company that's particularly new, and there is somebody particularly involved with the founding or the co-founding of Tesla involved in Petra, this particular company, and they're not involved with Elon's Boring Company at all, but that concept of Petra, they started with really trying to experiment with plasma technology, but they decided to use really gases, a combination of gases and heat in terms of really boring into particular spaces. And it seems like, a lot is going on with Petra in general, and that's very much, they're a pioneer in their own right. Definitely pioneering tunnel technology for sure. Another thing is 3D printed tunnel linings. Those things are really going to help with the concept of stabilizing underground space in general. And I mean, when it comes down to construction, I'm not sure how familiar you guys are with construction, but time is money. And when it comes down to 3D printed tunnel linings, how you do it, what it can do, those things could be a real time-saving thing. Ultimately, turn a project completely on its head when it comes down to the time you think would take to do a project underground without 3D lining technology versus for 3D lining technology. Very much something that needs to be explored and really thought about in terms of when we do decide to really make this a priority. Lastly, we got self-healing concrete. And when it comes down to concrete in its natural form and its natural way, you expect concrete to crack. It's actually built to, when you build concrete, you built it to crack in certain ways, so it doesn't crack in really just less desirable ways, to be frank. But when it comes down to self-healing concrete, the concept of concrete itself healing, that could be something that is tremendous, particularly in underground spaces, because if you have a leak underground, those particular spaces, that could turn disastrous very quickly. And when it comes down to this self-healing concrete, a lot of it's built to where, there are microbes in the or that are really native to the concrete that are going to naturally aggregate certain I will say, I'm not sure what lime is in general, but certain chemical compounds to just be essentially waterproof. And that would be tremendous in terms of how you design these spaces, because when it comes down to a lot of underground construction, it may very well depend on concrete being able to do its job for a very long period of time. And the life of concrete in general, it may very well suffer. It may be, when we talk about the main differences between above ground construction and below ground construction, concrete could be a limiting factor or a very, just a tremendous factor in terms of how long space lasts in general. The proposal for this particular video is the Underground Housing and Infrastructure Act, and this is a proposal for federal support to help build cities or help build underground faster and cheaper, and also create a local board for really just every overcrowded city to manage underground development. And this would involve residents, which are just the everyday people, to get a say in design and rules, as well as live updates from a public website or dashboard. It would also include affordable housing groups, so just to make sure that we are really prioritizing affordable housing. We don't want these spaces to really fall under gentrification in a lot of cases, and that's going to be really huge in terms of having them involved in the particular board, the boards that are created from this particular act. Also, engineers and architects to help keep buildings safe and residences livable. Another thing would be geologists and environmentalists to protect, but also create plans to improve upon the land and the water. These particular spaces, these underground developments, I think they have a tremendous amount of potential, of course, at the surface level, but when it comes down to what they can do and the investment that we put into them for their development, I think this can really help us in terms of understanding, of course, underground construction and environment, but also how we do things and how we pioneer, say for instance, water treatment, how we really can use this space to promote more healthy landscapes in general, biodiverse landscapes. There are there's a lot under the surface in terms of the potential here, and we're just really talking. I mean, we're just scratching that surface, to be honest with you. This particular act would involve grants and tax breaks for cities that participate in building underground housing. Also, faster permits, so no red tape for safe and approved projects. This could be linked to safe and approved just contractors in general. Also, when it comes down to a success reward, so for extra funding for cities that particularly build the most affordable, or really a significant amount of affordable homes or residences. I don't know if we'll call them homes underground, but also save money by using underground spaces. And they can also do things like reduce traffic and parking problems, of course, above ground and above area, just above ground and in cities in general. The concept is that transition period, right? So we talked a little bit about that parking, that idea of creating underground spaces for parking. This isn't new. We do this a lot. But in terms of that opportunity there, creating a city that may not necessarily have to be built to just be efficient parking and just road usage for personal vehicles, we can translate that into being more appealing places in general, right? So just increasing the general magnetism of a place in a city in general. And regardless, a lot's involved here, and this is, like I said, we're scratching the surface. We're just scratching the surface, and when it comes down to underground construction and the Renaissance, I think there is tremendous potential here. If, like I said, the underground space design by John Carmody and Raymond Sterling, please look that up. And if you have any type of interest in really just underground space design in general, for everyone else, thank you for listening. Comment, please, with what do you feel like would make underground living or work more appealing, or even just appealing in general? Also, please do the YouTube stuff, like, comment. If you're on podcast, follow. And if anything, I am hoping to see you guys soon. Thanks.